Good afternoon, everybody. I must say I'm very pleased to moderate this roundtable because they are such authoritative participants that represent regulators and institutions and investors' perspective. I'm particularly pleased because ESG is definitely a key element and a strategic subject to Aviva Group, to whom I belong. And perhaps as a small anecdote, I'd like to mention that during the Climate Week and the General Assembly of the United Nations a few days ago in New York, that took place in New York, our CEO, Mark Wilson, launched the World Benchmarking Alliance for Sustainability. So, key topic, definitely. But all players in the financial markets, such as Aviva, are also key and keen, definitely, to support sustainability. But I think we will be stronger if we do it within a coordinated European framework. So I guess the elaboration of a European responsible asset management single market will need strong coordination of your respective views and ambitions. Our discussion today will surely show us some way forward to do so. And my first question is for you, Verena. Can you tell us, in the ESMA, how ESG matters?
Thank you very much, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. A hugely important topic and something that we care a lot about in ESMA. At the same time, I have to say, if we look at our current core objectives, they very firmly embed investor protection, financial stability, and orderly markets at the core of what we have to do. So ESG and issues around sustainability have often a very important indirect effect and ultimately are important for investors and for the markets. But it is often in rather small areas where we have concretely worked on this. And so I thought I would just mention maybe 3 brief examples to explain where we've worked in the area, particularly of ESG issues. The first one, and actually something that we've done together with our colleagues at EIOPA, is the work on PRIPS, the packaged retail and insurance-based investment products, where we were given a mandate to look specifically at the PRIPS that target specific environmental and social objectives. And we were asked to actually help define how can you try to specify that particularly, and how can you make sure that the disclosure around the investment policies is clear. How can you measure progress? What are the governance arrangements you might want to have around that? So we provided some comments on that at a European basis. Obviously, we are also aware that in this space there's quite a lot of work going on at national level, so I'm sure Robert will say a few more words about that. The second example I was going to mention is the social entrepreneurship funds, the USEFs. Actually quite a small community at the moment, I have to say. We have all of 7 funds at the moment at the European level, but they're a very precious little group. And we basically, again, under the USEF regulation, provided some detailed regulatory provisions, trying to be clear about what these social objectives might be, how you measure them, and what you can, these funds that basically benefit from a slightly lighter regime that allows the fund managers to provide these funds across Europe, and how that can be specified. Given how little success this had so far, the Commission is reviewing as well how can they further improve this in the Capital Markets Union context, and it's something that we are actively working on and will be involved on going forward. And finally, and by no means least, the whole issue of corporate reporting and transparency, and there, particularly in relation to the directive on non-financial reporting, where companies are required since December last year to report very clearly on their, in their management report on corporate social responsibility, environmental issues, be clear about the risks that they might face from particularly environmental issues and how they are dealing with those risks. So those are maybe the three concrete areas I would point out.
Thank you. Robert, do you want to say a word about the French regulator sensitivity?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like I look forward having the Europe and the ESMA taking a strong lead in these matters, and I'm very satisfied to see that it's clearly in the CMU project, and it's also clearly put in the project reform of ESMA to have these issues as a core responsibility. So, waiting for that, and we have started a long time ago to put a lot of commitment behind these ESG matters. And in three different, let me mention three different areas. The very first one is a classic for a security market, financial market supervisor, which is the disclosure. The appropriate disclosure on ESG issues. And we started in 2010 to make reports on social, societal, and environmental responsibility information disclosed by listed companies. And the last report was done last year. And in 2015, we started to focus on a different set of institutions, no longer issuer, but collective investment schemes. And we have done that in 2015, and our second edition of the report will be released later this year. And it's fairly appropriate because the regulation in France changed, that's been mentioned, and starting in 2016, what we call the Loi sur la transition énergétique pour la croissance verte came into force. And we have reviewed the way it's implemented by investment firms, and so we will. I'm not yet the final outcome of our review, but I should say it's a balanced assessment. We have made progresses, but we are not yet at the final situation. And just to take just one example, I'm not sure that the carbon footprint is properly measured and released. That's the first set of issue, which is appropriate reporting. Let me just briefly mention two other issues. The second one is
quite
benchmark.
Just if you can summarize a little.
Benchmarks, because starting next year there will be the benchmark regulation, and as a national supervisor we will look very closely at this issue. And the third one is public education. We have deeply involved in a public education program, and ESG matters should be deeply in this program, and they are. That's three areas.
Thank you very much. Nicolas, during our preparation, you mentioned that the EFAMA has a SRI working group. Can you tell us about the importance of this theme for you?
Sure, thank you very much. So as you know, the EFAMA is the European Association for the Asset Management Industry, representing the whole of the asset management industry in Europe. And as an asset management industry, providing investing in companies, in government, on behalf of our clients, whether retail clients that invest in our funds or institutional investors, we are at the heart of the issue of responsible investment, because it's more and more something expected from the companies in which we invest, and it's of course a strong and more a requirement from the investors. So EFAMA launched, I think it was in 2010, this Responsible in working group with members that come from national associations such as AFG, but also directly corporate members, which is very important to have practitioners. And the purpose of this working group is first to be a forum for all our members to discuss on trends, developments in this field, which is changing a lot, to try to define standards and the common definition, common approach, or at least to be able to classify or understand what we can put behind responsible investment. And of course, to contribute to the European debate on this issue, to interact with the legislator, with the regulators, to interact with the representative of the issuers, to define, again, to define standards, to contribute to new initiatives such as the one Youssef and so on that were mentioned. So to give just recent example, this working group and EFAMA published last year, September 2016, a rather comprehensive report on responsible investment, giving a view of what is or what can be responsible investment at the European level, but with also a lot of details country by country on the various approach we can find in our various countries. Another recent example is answer the contribution by to the survey from the high-level expert group put in place by the Euro Commission just a few last month, I think, on sustainable investment.
Thank you. And last, on the sensitivity topic about your institution, what is EOPIA pushing or looking as most important in the vast ESG field?
Thanks a lot, first of all, for the kind invitation, of course. What EIOPA is interested in, let's say, in this field, of course, as Verena was also mentioning, it's a very relevant thing, and is also true what in the previous panel they said, who is against sustainable finance. So, of course, EIOPA, as all the European supervisors in pension and insurance sector, are very interested in monitoring, understanding the risk and the opportunities related to this. Our sector is the natural long-term investment, so it's really relevant for us. What we are doing, as it was said, actually in the mandate, this has an indirect effect of our main purpose. Nonetheless, we are very much interested in contributing to the work that are being done, and they were mentioned. On the PRIPS, Verena already mentioned our effort to clarify what is maybe particularly the issue for us can be the attention to really be aligned with the capital requirement. Because when it comes to incentivize a certain investment, it's the main purpose is to really have an evidence of the risks and not to deviate from an appropriate capital measurement of those risks. Having said this, we have worked, for example, recently on a separate class of infrastructure project in Solvency II for the insurance sector. This is an example where, based on the evidence, we provided the Commission with the appropriate advice to, let's say, facilitate, encourage, incentivize a certain kind of investment. Other tools that we can use are the stress test to really address the concern and put some emphasis on those risks. For example, recently the Dutch colleagues have done a very thorough analysis of climate change's risks. And what we are also interested in, and it was also mentioned, is a clear definition of what is sustainable asset. Maybe we can talk about it later on, but labeling the investment, having an appropriate taxonomy, this can help the supervisor to understand better risks and opportunity and to incentivize the appropriate way ahead.
Thank you. Let's move now to how to become and how Europe can become the world leader in SRI. And perhaps beginning by Nicolas, in your experience of all European countries, ESG approaches, which one, or perhaps which ones, will, according to you, be leading the European convergence?
That's true that at least initially the approach to investment, responsible investment in Europe are very diverse. You have countries, especially Nordic countries, where a lot of focus was really on exclusion. The idea was when we invest to exclude sector companies that for some reason are felt not being responsible. You have another approach which is more based on engagement, being an active shareholder and to try to influence through the exercise of vote to influence the behavior of the companies or the issuers you are investing in. Probably more dominant initially in the Anglo-Saxon world, and you have also an approach which is probably more important in Latin countries, especially in France, which is more a best-in-class approach, meaning that you don't exclude a specific country or a specific sector or corporate, but you try to evaluate, to rank through social governance and environment criteria the various issuers, and you take into account this rating in your investment policy, trying to globally to invest in average in sector in companies that are that have a better behavior in terms of environment, social or government impact. So what we have seen is that we are starting from very different starting points, but what we are starting to see is a convergence of this approach, meaning that I think especially due to the fact that responsible investment is becoming mainstream. A few years ago, it was something including in our in our companies that were treated by people separately from the mainstream investment. Now more and more it's integrated into the, I would say, the normal investment practice of our companies. It's also more and more something that is expected from the investors. So by being mainstream, you have to converge and taking into account all this approach. So in terms of approach, I would say really it's a convergence rather than one approach that is dominating. If the question is between the E, the S, and the G, where should be the priority? I think the three of them go together, and that's, I think it's clearly aligned at EFAMA. But if there's one area that probably more focus, more investigation can be done in the short term, it's maybe more on the E, on the environment, with probably more work to be done on a green bond and taking into account the energy transition into the investment practices.
Robert, perhaps a word. According to you, what conditions would be needed to become a world leader, and are there some impediments?
Three main elements should be enhanced. The very first one, I think we need more harmonization of disclosure of relevant extra-financial sustainable elements. Right now, these large institutionals are the main drivers for the demand for such assets. What they need is the basic disclosure. So harmonization of disclosure is key for them. The second, it's what about the retail investors or the medium-sized institutions? It's probably they need a label, and a European label could be useful for them, not for the large one, but for the small. And third, there is a need to expand the disclosure to medium-sized companies, not only to large ones. And in France, we have many people which are very involved in that. Just Vigeo has been mentioned. We have Gaia Index. We have many of them. I think that it's a third element which would be very, very useful to become not the world leader, but a world leader.
And Fausto, last, from an insurance perspective, according to you, what do you see as the conditions needed to be a SRI leader market?
As was mentioned, the definition are important, the taxonomy is important, the labeling of the sustainable asset are important. We also are in favor of disclosure, as it was also said. The insurance and pension fund needs to include those elements into their risk assessment. For insurance sector, we have the own risk and solvency assessment document that can provide good information for the supervisor and also to make an analysis of those risks for the insurers itself. But all in all, let me also mention that the important thing is to have a good project. The supply of project is very important, because sometimes we have we heard from the undertaking that in the end there are not so many good project in which to invest till now.
Okay, let's move perhaps now to another angle, which is how to promote the development of the single SRI European market. And definitely in your capacity as a market authority, as a regulator, as an investment association, your role is probably very key to succeed in this project. To achieve this unique SRI and leading European market. So perhaps we could see how you are today, but more importantly, probably how you will go further to support this ambition. And perhaps beginning again with you, what are your views?
So sometimes we hear that the solvency, especially in the insurance sector, the Solvency II regulation does not really give incentives to long-term investment, which we do not believe is the case. Actually, we really believe that is possible with the current system, maybe also for the refinement of the system, which are already foreseen in the coming years, can continue to help. But for the time being, we still are convinced that the market consistent valuation is the best way to also take into account ESG factors. The prudent person principle, which is embedded in Solvency II, gives enough freedom to the insurers to invest in the different category where they prefer. This also means that the capital requirement, because of this freedom in investment, has to be adequate for the risks, and that's why we pay a lot of attention to those kind of capital charge when it comes to new kind of investment, or measure the risk of those investments. And of course there are specific measure for long-term guarantees that are also working. Solvency II now is in place, and we have seen that it's working. As I already mentioned, we have also refined some investment classes in terms of risk capital charge for the risk recently. So we are keen to continue to work together with the Commission, the other relevant stakeholder on this. We are now working on facilitating a bit the investment in unrated debt and unlisted equity. It's not specifically on sustainable finance, but it's a bit related. So all in all, we are ready to continue to refine the current system in order to further develop this kind of sustainable investment. We have also been told that the accounting system sometimes is an obstacle. Now we are preparing, let's say, the work on the implementation endorsement. Let's see what happens of the new international capital standard for insurance contract. We will pay a lot of attention to it in order to avoid, of course, that the investment in equity is disincentivized. But let me also add that currently the figures that we have in EIOPA, and you know that we have a database of all the insurance industry around Europe, does not show that there is this incentive. The investment in equity is still maybe stable over the year. So again, happy to continue to work, but also focus on refinement of the current system instead of just thinking.
Perhaps on the IMF side, Robert, do you have some ideas that could help this project to move on?
We are a small actor in this field, but what we will do is what is done for what we are doing for governance, meaning in our regular review, name and shame, name and price, the firms, the asset managers, whose information are appropriate according to the ESG standards, and make proposal to improve this transparency exercise. And what we have seen for governance is that it's very useful to have the regulator, the supervisor, naming and pricing or shaming some practices. And we will do that for ESG matters.
On the ESMA side, when we discussed during the preparation, we see that you had a lot of interactions with the AMF, but do you have some more specific elements on what the European regulator can put as priorities?
I think just coming back to the earlier discussion, I mean, there's clearly a push and a pull factor here. Society is changing, consciousness is changing, so that is clearly driving some things. But I think also from the regulatory and supervisory front at a European level, we can contribute to that. And in particular, obviously, we have a advantage where it comes to the cross-border angles, and we should be very clear that there are issues where we can help to reduce some of the cross-border barriers, and I was mentioning the UCEFs earlier, but one of the proposals in changing the regime is also to reduce, for example, the fees that some of these funds still face when they want to actually passport to another country and things like that. So those kind of issues clearly are still there, hampering maybe some of the development. I think from our perspective, it's all around the disclosure, as was already mentioned, the investment policies, benchmarks, also what markets do and what secondary market trading venues do in terms of actually allowing those kind of products to be traded and displaying them and making them widely available. All of this we will spend a lot more time on, not just because it's becoming a very important issue globally and at European level, and we've seen recently, as you already mentioned, the report from the high-level expert group, which will clearly push some more ideas in this area, but also in the ESA review, as Robert already mentioned, where our founding regulation is under review. There will be now an objective added in the proposal of the Commission that explicitly refers to the ESAs and ESMA as one of them, specifically looking at environmental, social, and governance objectives in its regulation and supervision. And I think that will really also force us in a good way to be even more focused on this topic.
So, Nicolas, you have heard a lot of ideas about the regulators. So, as what the industry expect from the regulators, that answer to the needs you think, and also what EFAMA can do to help and this development also alongside the regulators.
So first, what we expect from the regulators, I would say it's mainly related to transparency and quality of data. I mean, to contribute to the fact that we need to have data coming from the investors that are, as far as possible, reliable, comparable, standardized if possible, and also that we are able to provide to our investors also data through our reportings, data that they can understand and that they can compare. So I think this role is very important. It should be through guidelines, through orientations, maybe name and shame, rather than legislation probably, because it's a field that changes a lot. So fixing things in legislation is probably not adequate in this field. So I think it's probably the main element that we would expect. On the contrary, we would say what we wouldn't recommend standardization on the financial products ourselves or on the processes, because we need to let innovation and market development work properly. In terms of what an association like EFAMA can do and is doing, I think is threefold. The first aspect is on our side to promote and to contribute to this harmonization of standard and reporting. Second element is to contribute to public education, and especially to issuers education, but as well as investors education, through a permanent dialogue with their representative and by promoting best practices. And the third element is to work closely with our regulators, with the policy makers, to ensure that what we just discussed, standardization, adequate disclosure, really ensure that we match the financing needs of the economy and the expectation of the investors.
Thanks a lot for all these interesting details. Let's assume now that we have a single European responsible investment market. And I would like to end this discussion with the anticipated consequences of having such a market. So what impact do you foresee in terms of market dynamics, of performance and flows for our funds, or any other, I would say, virtuous effect on the European economy? Robert, perhaps let's start with you.
At the end of the day, what we want is to reduce the cost of financing companies or projects taking into account these ESG aspects, and that's the good outcome. And at the same time, we need to clearly monitor what has been mentioned by the former roundtable, which is what's the risk-adjusted return of these assets, and what we do expect it's how to increase the growth possibility of our economy, and that's clearly in investing in that type of asset, and the cost of them is key.
Nicolas, EFAMA is surely well placed to address the questions of fund performance and flows. What do you think can new investors coming in that kind of market can expect from such a market and SRI, unique, strong?
So maybe first on performance question we often have, performance of responsible investment approach funds compared to other. There have been a lot of studies on the report, the responsible investment report published by EFAMA last year that I mentioned, did a survey on the surveys, I would say, and looked at, I think, several hundreds of surveys on that, and on this issue, and I mean, the bottom line is that it tends to prove that at least there's non-negative relation between, there's not a negative relation between responsible investment and performance compared to other funds, and often it can be a positive performance. And going forward, I think that, and that's why we see more and more investors being interested in those kind of approaches, is that basically what they expect is to benefit from by anticipation for improved risk management, because really taking into account the responsible aspect of your investment is taking into account risk, whether social risk, whether environmental risk, that are not often adequately priced today in the market. So that's for the performance. In terms of flows, I don't have any specific numbers in mind, but what we see clearly is a growing demand from investors. And we see some investors that were not interested very much by this approach a few years ago, and now that more and more we see them through RFPs, for example, being interested by responsible investment. Just to give an example, for example, the Japanese public funds, public sovereign funds, now today they are really taking into account responsible investment in their approach. But it's also true from clients from Latin America. It's true for corporate pension funds. A few years ago, it was mainly an issue for, let's say, public investors. Now it's more and more true for private investors. So for the European industry to be at the forefront of this approach, it's also it's something you have to do based on our fiduciary duty and our duty to the society, but it's also something that we have to do to answer the need of our clients and gain market share, basically.
Perhaps last question for you, Fausto, is what is the position of the pension funds in Europe, but also more broadly? And what ESG can drive in terms of growing interest for European assets? Do you think that could bring an added value for them?
Yes, yes, for sure, because the European directive on YORPS is more recent than the one in the insurance, and already mention and embed some ESG elements into the system. So it seems to us that the implementation of the directive will enable the pension fund to really address the risk and opportunity of the ESG factors. It was also mentioned before in the previous panel by Jan William that this implementation of the directive is also, of course, now still in place, but it's in many places of the directive the ESG factor come into effect. So we expect that the national implementation will further foster this. Those elements. So having those elements in place, having from a European side the sort of help or supplementation of these measures with some supervisory tool as the stress test I mentioned before, we believe that this will give a regulatory framework where a pension fund can really play an important role as is it the case for the investment in sustainable finance.
Verena, anything to add compared to on the European impact?
No, I very much share the views of my colleagues here on the panel, but I think, you know, trying to find capital market financing for those type of firms that are looking at promoting environmental, social and governance factors is clearly something which, you know, fits very squarely in the whole capital markets union idea. And it is about making sure that ultimately we also meet the demands which are increasingly there from the investors to promote that type of investment and to offer the type of funds and the type of capital market instruments that basically allow them to also express their wish to help the economy and the society to move in that direction.
This could open a question with Unibail Rodamco, which should be very well supported on that front, and but having the tax issue, we might have a contradiction here to be discussed further. Before closing our discussion, I would like just to ask to the three regulators one question. So EFAMA mentioned that his priority, according to him, should be probably the environment in the ESG field. Do you all agree that should be the priority and that we should converge there? Because that's a first step of convergence, is the different angles, point of view. So is it something you share, or do you want anybody to?
We share this view. This is a priority. As I said, it's I mean, everybody. It regards the future of all of us. So we need to really. It was mentioned also before. Cooperation between the different actors and stakeholders can only help. Having said that, is a priority.
So everybody seems to agree.
It's very hard to be against social and good governance as well, but no, I can see that obviously, you know, it is a very hot topic, and I think the impact that we are seeing day to day of the environmental issues that we are facing is clearly making it, at least at the moment, one of the key topics, yes.
Okay, so I would like to thank you all for disclosing your convictions and ambitions with us on this very vast topic. I think we heard promising ideas and that can help making the world more sustainable. So I think we now have to work in concrete actions and make further steps. Europe is definitely at the forefront of SRI. I think we should keep that lead and continue, but we probably really need to have a European clearer framework. So we have to work on that with a common understanding of SRI. And definitely your joint action is instrumental for that. In sum, if I make a summary, you are convinced that ESG should attract more institutional assets and will generate positive impact on European growth. So we are all happy to hear about this. And perhaps let's now turn on the audience to answer some questions.
Ines,
Thank
you very much. Thank you to our panel. Okay, let's see your first question today. Let's see what we've got. In the context of the COP23 that's coming up next month in Germany and the US position on the Paris agreements, which we all know, is Europe the most credible player to take the lead on anti-global warming finance? Who'd like to speak to that?
Who wants to answer to that? Still reading the question.
Is Europe the most credible player to take the lead? Who else would take the lead? Asia? The States?
Nicolas?
I believe what we have been discussing for this afternoon probably should demonstrate that yes, Europe is a credible player to take the lead on this issue, clearly.
And if I can add, as you mentioned, I think that if we are not completely convinced by deduction, as it will certainly not be the States, and probably Asian is still a little farther from that, when we see where China is, even if they are very committed, they are quite far. So we might expect that Europe could be the leader.
Do we have another question? Let's see what we've got. Okay, the UN-supported PRI are expanding among financial institutions, asset management in particular. Is that a good thing? And should we go faster and further in Europe? Who'd like to speak to that? Should we go faster and further?
I think responsible investment is clearly expanding. I think we talked about that earlier. And, we also said that we believe that there was the need to look at how we can further enhance that and how it can be further speeded up. So I think the answer, again, is a yes from my perspective.
Doesn't that come with risks, though?
I just wanted to agree because it's a good starting point. What the group is doing, the principle are the right one, and we can just elaborate and go further in the European system.
Robert, anything?
That's the same story. Some countries are leading in Europe, and Europe should be leading in the world. That's the way we are enhancing and making progress.
All right, I think we have another question now. Let's see what we've got. OK, une gestion d'actifs par des professionnels n'est-elle pas par essence responsable, notamment? OK, isn't active management, by definition, responsible, particularly in regard to investors? Where's the line?
Yes, I mean, again, our business or our activity, what is it? It's to manage funds on behalf of investors, whether retail clients or institutional clients, but who themselves have their own stakeholders, their own investors. So by nature, yes, we have to be responsible to them, and integrating responsible investment is part of the job. Yeah.
But if I can add, I think that we had long discussions, specifically during the Jean-Louis round table, that behind responsible you have a lot of things. So I guess that asset managers have always felt that they are responsible for something. What has to be defined is of what.
Indeed, that is the question. I think we have one last question that's come from you. Let's see what that is. Ok, ne veut-on pas déjà en Europe un véritable marché unique pour tout? Okay, aren't we already developing in Europe a true single market for all asset management, whether it's responsible or not? Is there cohesion in Europe?
We try to do that, but we are far from that. From that.
Yeah.
And I do count on ESMA to achieve that, but
Well,
currently it's not yet done, I should say.
I agree. I mean, if we were already there, I think the market would look quite different. But we are clearly trying to progress in that direction. It's not always easy. Some differences also are based on fundamental differences in investment culture, investment and market structures, which are not overcome easily. But I think that's our duty to move in that direction, and that we're trying to do, whether through our regulatory or our supervisory convergence work, very clearly.
If I may add something on the insurance and pension side, it's similar in the end, but we need to just, and I very much agree, we are not yet there, of course, but we need to continue. This is the target that we all have, and the ESA's review provides a good opportunity to further enhance the creation of a single market for asset management or insurance, pension fund, and so on. So we need to keep the opportunity of the ESA's review and go ahead with the building up of the single market.
All right, thank you very much to all of you, and grand merci à tout notre panel.